We've got liftoff in Bonner.
In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for member statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The member for Whitlam.
Questions to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, what is the impact on the economy of a net zero emissions target by 2050?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, if you have the right plan, it's a positive impact, Mr Speaker.
Members on my left.
If you have the right plan, Mr Speaker, if you have technology, not taxes, Mr Speaker, if you don't have a carbon tax, Mr Speaker, if you actually have a plan that respects people's choices rather than to force their choices, Mr Speaker, if you have a balance of technologies, a portfolio of technologies that can get to scale, and, Mr Speaker, that can get to an affordable cost, if you can ensure that you get the balance right between affordable and reliable energy, Mr Speaker, and you don't rush the plan, Mr Speaker, and you allow those technologies to develop, and you have your transition fuels in place to ensure you keep the lights on and the costs down, Mr Speaker, and if you have a credible plan, Mr Speaker, with the proper transparency, as Australia is well known for, then it can be a great positive for Australia. It can be a great positive for Australia. But, Mr Speaker, if you take the approach that those opposite took when they were in government, which put in place a carbon tax, Mr Speaker, and I note now the Labor Senator, Senator Gallagher, has belled the cat, Mr Speaker, that a carbon price from Labor is back on the table. It's back on the table, Mr Speaker. So really what this will be about, Mr Speaker, ultimately in anyone's ambitions to achieve net zero, it's all about the plan. It's all about the economic plan, Mr Speaker, and who Australians would trust with the economic plan that can take Australians through what would be a very challenging time. And Mr Speaker, who they can trust to really look after rural and regional Australia, Mr Speaker, who they can really trust to do that. And they know they can't trust the Labor Party on these issues, Mr Speaker. At the last election, they took a policy
I'll
to
just
the
say
election,
to
the
Prime Minister's now drifting from what was a very specific question. He's compared and contrasted, but he's now drifted off the question, and I need him to come back to the question.
No. Well, Mr Speaker, again, with the right plan, it's a positive benefit, Mr Speaker. With the right plan, it's a positive benefit. But what we do know is this, Mr Speaker, and that is the global economy is changing as the world responds to climate change.
Members on my left. Member
that
for
is
Isaacs.
true. And those changes, Mr Speaker, will have an impact on the Australian economy. They do present risks and threats to rural and regional areas, and only the coalition can be trusted to ensure that we can deal with those threats, that we can support rural and regional Australia, Mr Speaker. And if you don't believe me, believe the member for Hunter, Mr Speaker, and the member for Hunter makes it pretty clear that Labor has lost its way on that issue.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The national plan to safely reopen our nation and live with COVID-19 is being realised through the actions of Australians like those in my Western Sydney community coming forward
Member
to
for
get
Barton
vaccinated.
is warned.
Will the Prime Minister update the House on how the national plan is ending restrictions and building our path out of the pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Lindsay for her question. It's great to see her back in this chamber, as there are so many other members now back in this chamber, which is reflective of the fact that Australia is opening up. Mr Speaker, our national plan is working. The national plan that we began working together on with the Doherty Institute back in March, a plan that was agreed not once but twice by all premiers and chief ministers around the country as I brought that national plan forward, Mr Speaker. The plan that is based on the best scientific and medical research and analysis and advice available, Mr Speaker, that plan is working. That plan, Mr Speaker, which is to safely open and then remain safely open, Mr Speaker, that is a plan that we're now seeing realised right across the country, a plan that set out clear vaccination targets, scientifically determined, to know that when Australians pass those targets, Mr Speaker, they could be confident that we could open safely and remain safely open, Mr Speaker. Australians have responded to this
Member for
plan.
Greenway.
Australians have rolled up their sleeves. Australians are keeping their part of the deal that has come together as part of the national plan. 69.2% of Australians aged over 16 today, Mr Speaker, have been double vaccinated. As a share of total population, Australia's double vaccination rate is now higher than the United States. It is higher than the United States on double-dose vaccinations. And in the member's own electorate, Mr Speaker, in the LGA of Penrith, 84% of those in Penrith, Mr Speaker, are double-dose vaccinated. And, Mr Speaker, I hasten to add that in the Sutherland Shire that figure's 89%, Mr Speaker. So thank you to all those in the Sutherland Shire in southern Sydney. Mr Speaker, the vaccination rates are surging in New South Wales above 90%. Above 90% on their first dose rates. New South Wales is opening. Australians are coming home. 52,300 downloads of their international vaccination certificates over the last 24 hours. Mr Speaker, Victoria is opening up. And I note in particular Victoria's roadmap, just announced. Victoria's roadmap, delivering the national plan, Mr Speaker, from the Victorian State Government. I welcome that, Mr Speaker. Queensland is opening up, Mr Speaker. The Queensland borders will be coming down, Mr Speaker. We welcome that as Queensland honours the national plan. ACT is finally opening up, Mr Speaker, as well as South Australia, Northern Territory and Tasmania. I spoke to the Tasmanian and South Australian premiers this morning, confirming, Mr Speaker, their commitments. Mr Speaker, as a country, one of the lowest fatality rates in the world when it comes to COVID, one of the strongest economic stories and recoveries during the COVID pandemic, and, Mr Speaker, we're on the track now to ensure we have one of the world's highest vaccination rates.
Just before I call the member for McMahon, it's right that we have a large number of members back here in the chamber, which is fantastic. The unfortunate bit is it's been accompanied by a rise in interjections, and I just remind members it's taken a long time to get some of you back. It would be a pity if you'd come back only to be ejected under 94A. The member for McMahon.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer in which he mentioned the importance of transparency. Will the Prime Minister release government modelling on the impacts of net zero emissions by 2050 presented to the Nationals party room? Why is this modelling secret?
The Prime Minister has the call. Yeah, no, the Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left.
Mr Speaker, I'm just seeking your clarification as to how the Prime Minister can be asked to answer that question, particularly given I suspect the member for McMahon
the Leader of the House pause?
Misstated
Leader
the
of the House
question,
just pause for a second. Leader of the House just pause for a second. No one interjecting on my left is helping me hear the Leader of the House. The Leader of the House, if you could start again.
Mr Speaker, as I understood not that I was paying great attention to the member for McMahon, as probably the case for most in this chamber, but I heard the member for McMahon, Mr Speaker, talk about the presentation to the Nationals party room, and I don't know how that can be within the Prime Minister's remit. He was not in the meeting. He didn't attend the meeting. It was entirely appropriately a matter for the National Party, and I don't know how the Prime Minister could be expected, Mr Speaker, to answer that question.
No, if the Manager Opposition Business can perhaps just resume his seat. The question was whether the Prime Minister would release the modelling that was provided to the party room, and the member for Chifley, wasn't it? I'll get you eventually. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, well, I can't speak to the discussions of the Nationals party room any more than the Leader of the Nationals can speak to the discussions of the Liberals party room, Mr Speaker. We're two great proud parties. We've formed a great coalition, Mr Speaker, as we have done for many, many years and continue to do so. Mr Speaker, what I can be very clear to the Australian people about is we will be very transparent about what our commitments are. very transparent about what our commitments are, what the costs are, Mr Speaker, what the outcomes are going to be, and they can trust me to do that because that's exactly what I did at the last election, Mr Speaker. At the last election, I set out very clearly what our 2030 target was going to be, how we were going to achieve it, that we would meet and beat it, what the costs would be, what the programs were, Mr Speaker, and as a result, the Australian people backed our plan. Now, those opposite, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party, they had a 45% emissions reduction target. The then Leader of the Opposition couldn't explain those issues, Mr Speaker. He couldn't level with the Australian people. He couldn't explain
to the
costs,
Prime
Mr.
Minister,
Speaker.
this is it's not an opportunity to now move off the question, which was a very specific one about whether he would or wouldn't release modelling. And I think the Prime Minister's answered that, but it's not an opportunity to talk about the opposition policies at the last election.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I can be very clear with the Australian people. We will set these things out very, very clearly because that is our form. That is what we have done. Because, Mr Speaker, I think it's very important for Australians to know what our plans are, as they are aware of all plans of those who would go to the next election pretending to do various things. Now, we'll be very clear about our plans. People know what our 2030 commitment is, Speaker. It's a mystery what those opposites' 2030 commitment is, Mr Speaker. There's no plan there. There's no plan for 2050 from those opposite, Mr Speaker. We will release our plans. We will be clear about the costs. We will explain to people in rural and regional Australia in particular how we'll be standing with them as they work through the challenges that they will face and realise the opportunities are there for more jobs, more opportunities, more investment and a stronger rural and regional Australia, Mr Speaker. So I welcome the fact that in asking this question, Mr Speaker, the Labor Party are saying that the standard is you've got to tell people what your plans are and what your costs are and what it means for them, Mr Speaker, and that will be the first time they've ever done that.
Prime Minister resume his seat. I think he's concluded. Prime Minister's concluded his answer. The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is ensuring a strong economic recovery in the regions by investing in infrastructure projects that support communities and create jobs?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Cowper for his question and note the tremendous work that he is doing. We actually have seats that are next door to one another, and projects such as the Wallamumby to Kempsey Road upgrade, which is vitally important, a road that's held by the council, and obviously it's beyond their capacity to do much with it, a road that not much has happened for a very, very long time, yet it's a vital interconnector between the two electorates. But it's not just that he's working on, Mr Speaker. I also note the work that he is doing on a smaller project such as the Sawtell swimming pool and the money he got through the BBRA for that. And it's the places such as the Sawtell swimming pool where he might get the next Maddie Goff. And wasn't Maddie Goff a great asset? She came fifth in the Olympics, smashed the Australian women's 1500-metre record at 15 minutes 47 seconds, if I remember rightly, for the member for Cowper. And that is the sort of asset that takes communities forward. But it's not just there, because we can't be parochial. When we are building a nation, we build it across the nation. And we have $1.6 billion on the table in the Hunter Valley for the Newcastle bypass. That $1.6 billion, which will be complemented by $400 million from the state government, goes to show that when we are building projects, we build them across the nation. We build them across the nation for a national plan. We build them across the nation to make a better nation. And it's not just there. Also in the Hunter Valley you have such things as the Singleton bypass, for which we're putting about $560 million towards. Because whether it's the Pacific Highway or the New England Highway are building to a nationals plan. And it's things such as the Coffs Harbour bypass as well, which I know the member for Cowper has put so much work towards. $1.4 billion, in fact a little bit more than $1.4 billion, to continue the dream and the vision for people such as Warren Truss, the former leader of the Nationals, Warren Truss, who had the dream of making sure that he could drive a car from Melbourne to north of Gympie without seeing a traffic light on a dual carriageway road. That is real vision. Continued on by the member for Riverina, continued on Avery by the member for Riverina. That dream, that Nationals dream, for which I'm now very proud of to be part of in the conclusion of that dream. This is important where it goes up to the member for Wide Bays, for the Tyro bypass, for the Cowper, in the seat of Cowper, for Coffs Harbour, and the seat of Hunter, for the Newcastle bypass. This is a Nationals and a national vision, and the coalition is putting the effort, putting the money, and delivering an outcome that is not just resides in seats of our leading, but resides in the seats across this nation for a national benefit.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I ask, has the government modelled the impact of net zero emissions by 2050? If the answer is yes, will the government release the modelling? If the answer is yes, when?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. When the government has fully considered these matters, we will be, of course, setting out all of our plans. And, Mr Speaker, we'll be setting out all of the benefits, and we'll be setting out, Mr Speaker, all of the matters that relate to those policies. And that is the answer to the question, Mr Speaker. And we'll be very transparent, Mr Speaker, where we have been able to assess the impacts of our policies and to demonstrate, Mr Speaker, those benefits, we will certainly do that. And that would be the case in the areas that the member has referred to. Mr Speaker, we'll be doing that before the next election, Mr Speaker, and I suspect we'll be doing a lot sooner before they make their mind up about their 2030 commitment, Mr Speaker. They asked me about this over a year ago, Mr Speaker, and they still can't tell the Australian people what their 2030 commitment. I don't know what the time delay is on that side, Mr Speaker, but they cannot make their mind up about
the Prime
2030.
Minister. The member for Whitlam will cease interjecting. The member for... We'll now go to the independence question. The member for Kennedy.
Prime Minister, since real exports are limited to iron ore, aluminium, copper, coal, all smelted with coal, if all exports then come directly or indirectly from coal, and if net zero 2050 is not a lie, can you convince China to give us solar panels for free and convince Australians to only turn their lights on during the day? Isn't how, not when, Bradfield Hells Gates producing zero-emission industries, high-protein algae, electricity, petrol as ethanol, sugar, all manufacturing industries. Isn't how yourself, Joyce Albanese, are after for our country. This is how.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, can I thank the member for Kennedy about his question regarding Hells Gate Dam, Mr Speaker, because I know the member for Kennedy is very committed to the agricultural production of Northern Queensland, as indeed the Nationals and the Liberals are, Mr Speaker, very committed to the agricultural production capability of Northern Queensland. And, Mr Speaker, and as the member will particularly know, the government has strongly supported the Hewett Irrigation Scheme, which I know is a project that he has had a keen interest in over a long time, and that is going to unlock significant potential for jobs and opportunities right across Northern Queensland, as we will also see with great projects like the Copper String project. Copper String project, which opens up that entire Northwest Minerals province, which this government is committed to, Mr Speaker, and taking those important projects forward for Northern Queensland, because we believe in the future of rural and regional Australia and the infrastructure and the energy it needs to realise its potential. But particularly on the issue of Hells Gate Dam, I'll defer to the Deputy Prime Minister.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I commend the member for Kennedy for the work that he has done for the people of North Queensland, and as a voice for so many people in so many regional areas. Although at times we mightn't agree, I absolutely respect the effort he puts into that. And Mr Speaker, he raised the issue of Hells Gate Dam. The business case for this we're expecting back early in the next year. And what I can say, Mr Speaker, is the best chance for the member for Kennedy getting that dam built is if a coalition government is in place. That would be the best opportunity and the best chance, because we too, and I definitely have the vision of Water West, of the capacity for us to fulfil the capacity of the national vision that we would open up new agricultural precincts in the black soils of Western Queensland, which I know the member for Kennedy knows so well. The member for Kennedy is also a great advocate for North Queensland as a coalition government that is moving the North Queensland Water Authority from Canberra to North Queensland. That is the sort of decentralisation package that stands behind that we have a belief of people away from this great city but into other parts of our nation as well. We also note that his work on the Hewitt irrigation scheme, which he has believed in for so long. I know that the member for Kennedy must get some solace and satisfaction from the fact that after battling for these projects for so long, that the prospect and the probability and the commitment to get these projects, to get projects for North Queensland done, is going to be done under a coalition government, because he knows what resides on the other side is nothing more than a plan for the inner suburbs of the cities that are their only hope of ever getting supported.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Higgins has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House how the Morrison government's strong economic management continues to set up the Australian economy to bounce back strongly as COVID-19 restrictions ease, and is the Treasurer aware of any alternative policies?
The Treasurer.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Higgins for her question and acknowledge her experience as a paediatrician at the Royal Children's Hospital for 28 years, Mr Speaker, and as a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. A real achievement, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Higgins, like others on this side of the House, know that today consumer confidence jumped for the 6th week in a row, Mr Speaker, and last week business confidence was up. And job ads are now 21% higher than they were at the start of the pandemic. And that last week, Fitch Credit Rating reaffirmed Australia's AAA credit rating and upgraded our outlook. And today, the Reserve Bank's minutes came out for the month of October, and they said that they were expecting the economy to bounce back strongly, Mr Speaker. And they said that the labour market had been more resilient this year than last year, and that in New South Wales firms were already looking to hire, Mr Speaker, ahead of those restrictions being lifted. This is the strong economic recovery that Australians could look forward to. This is the $17 billion that the Morrison government has put to support families and businesses through the Delta outbreak that will help support a strong economic recovery. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative policies? Well, the Leader of the Opposition in the last 2 years has had two big economic ideas in his head, Mr Speaker. Last year, you know what it was? It was a structural productivity-enhancing reform of a national driver's licence, Mr Speaker. That was going to see the Australian economy have a lift-off, Mr Speaker. Well, this year we got nothing in the budget in reply, so we've been waiting. We've been waiting with bated breath. 76 days ago we got it, Mr Speaker. $300 cheques to people who have already had the jab, Mr Speaker. $300 cheques to people who have already had the jab. Now, Mr Speaker, in the words of the Leader of the Opposition, this was going to be a $6 billion conversation starter. What it will do is spark conversation around the workplace, around communities. Have you got your $300 yet? Is a conversation we want, Mr Speaker. Well, I tell you who didn't want the conversation. His own shadow cabinet, Mr Speaker, because Senator Gallagher went on Insiders on Sunday and was asked by David Spears, should the government offer $300 to everyone or not? Senator Gallagher, I think probably the time has passed for that, Mr Speaker. It was a policy that was made on the run. It was a policy that was dumped on the run.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and the Minister for Regional Development. Has the Minister seen any modelling which shows the economic impact of net zero by 2050 for the regions? What does the modelling say about the economic impact on regional Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for Grayndler for his question. And yes, at this point in time, we are working very diligently and very closely through so many aspects of the issue of 2050, because it's incumbent upon us to make sure we look after the people of Albury, or we look after the people of Singleton, and we make sure we do the right thing by the people of Nowra and Queanbeyan. We are working very diligently to make sure that we look after people from Busselton to Mount Isa, that people in Albury and Wodonga. And so, to that purpose, Mr Speaker, we're going through every aspect of the plan that has been delivered to us, and we are making sure that we come up with the right capacity to go back to the people, whether it's in the seat of Cowper or whether it's in the seat of Flynn, or whether it's in the. So it's
the Deputy
Prime
Minister will resume his seat for a sec, and the Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order. Now, hang on. You don't have the call. The Manager of Opposition Business on
direct relevance, Mr Speaker. The question goes to whether he's seen modelling and the impact on the regions, not to read the table of contents from an atlas.
Going to the substantive part of the Manager of Opposition Business's point of order, which wasn't the last part, the question does ask, is very specific. The Deputy Prime Minister's been entitled to give some context, which he's done, and he's not even a minute in, but of course that can't be the entirety of his answer. The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I accept your ruling, but I would note how dismissive the Labor Party are of regional towns. How dismissive they are of regional towns. How they smirk and snigger whenever you mention
just so the
something
Deputy
away
Prime
from
Minister,
Grayndler.
you need to return to the question
So,
or wind
Mr
up your answer.
Speaker, I note quite clearly that there has been an absolute diligent oversight within the Liberal Party. The Leader of the Liberal Party, the member for Cook, the Leader of the Coalition Prime Minister of Australia, has a mandate from his party room, and I am going through the process of making sure that I respect the views of my party room. You aren't. The question goes to, we have certainly seen the results of modelling. Yes, we have. And we have seen that in a whole range of reflections on the price of commodities. So it's such a tricky question with such an easy answer, isn't it?
The member for Wentworth.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please update the House on how breakthrough COVID-19 treatments, along with Australia's vaccine program, are helping to save lives and save livelihoods?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Wentworth, who with his international experience will know that the pandemic continues to rage worldwide. 444,000 cases, 6,500 lives lost in the last 24 hours alone. But against that background, the vaccination program in Australia is saving lives and protecting lives. We're now at 32.9 million vaccinations in Australia. As the Prime Minister has mentioned, we've passed the 85% milestone for first doses. We are on the cusp of the third great milestone in relation to our second doses. We're on the cusp of that 70% mark as part of the national roadmap. And then, significantly, 1.9 million doses in the last 7 days, 3.9 million doses in the last 14 days, 7.8 million doses in the last 4 weeks. All of these things are about Australians coming forward in record numbers to protect themselves, to protect their friends, to protect their families and to protect their country. Indeed, one of the things I'm most pleased about is that there are now more than 1 million doses to those between 12 and 15 years of age. And we're almost at a 60% first dose rate in that group. But all of these vaccinations are very important protection, but they're not the only protection. What we've also been able to do is to acquire critical treatments, which are an additional complementary protection for Australians. Previously, we've mentioned Sotrovimab, 31,000 doses, a monoclonal antibody which is given in the hospital setting, and that's protecting people already in use in Australia and saving lives and protecting lives. But in the recent weeks, we've been able to announce acquisitions of drugs such as molnupiravir, 300,000 doses of an oral antibody, and equally 500,000 doses of the Pfizer oral antibody, again a pill. This means that we can ensure that wherever people are, they're given that protection, that ability that if they are diagnosed or they've been exposed, they have that additional support. None of these are a guarantee. They are not as strong as vaccines, and it's very important to say that vaccines are the frontline treatment. But only yesterday we had the approval from the TGA of Ronapreve. We've just acquired 15,000 doses of Ronapreve, a monoclonal antibody combination therapy. It's about being treated in hospital, and it has a 70% reduction in the likelihood of fatality for those for whom it's being applied. All of these treatments and vaccines are coming together to save lives, to protect lives, and to give Australians their lives back.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Regional Development, and I refer to his previous answer regarding the modelling of net zero by 2050 on regions in which he said, and I quote, "It has an impact on the price of commodities." What is that impact?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's quite obvious if the world is going where it is going, and I think even the member...
Members on my left.
And the member... I don't know what's so funny about that. I don't know, I mean...
Members on my left.
Well, it's hilarious, isn't it? So, so if they believe that the commodity prices, as been stated by so many sources, especially such things as coal, and let's note there's a whole range of coals, a whole range of calorific contents of coals, and they have different markets, then of course that does affect the price of commodities. It does affect, because if that is the case, and modelling of course is the best estimation. It is obviously not written on tablets of stone, but that estimation would naturally point to a change in demand which would reflect a change in price. So by reason of that, in the results of the modelling, which we have seen, it shows a downturn in coal price, in coal commodities over time. And I don't know what is remarkable about that. And I understand the tactics of the Labor Party, it's to try and trip me up, but you've got to sharpen that process up a bit.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table a document?
I'm asking a request, Mr Speaker, that the
Hang on.
Point of order. You're not in charge. That I'd ask the deputy.
I can't rule on something if he can't speak.
I'd ask
the Leader of the Opposition is.
Yes, I'm asking that the Deputy Prime Minister table the modelling that he was referring to in his answer.
Yes, you can't make that request. You can do it by way of a question. You can only ask for him to table a document he was reading from, and he wasn't reading from any document. The member for Menzies.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I asked the Minister for Defence if he will update the House on the Morrison government's AUKUS alliance with the United States and the United Kingdom and the benefits for securing our prosperity, our safety and our security in the future.
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Menzies for his question and also for his service in the defence portfolio. A very distinguished former Minister for Defence, and is a great supporter of our Australian Defence Force personnel. Mr Speaker, our government, as you know, is very clear-eyed about the threats within our own region in the Indo-Pacific. There are many countries, including now many European countries, who are worried about the unfolding circumstances in the Indo-Pacific, and it's absolutely appropriate that the first order of this government is to keep Australians safe and secure. We will do everything within our power, everything within our capacity to make decisions, to deliver on policies that will deliver that security and that peace to our region. And through the AUKUS program, Mr Speaker, through that compact, we have been able to bolster the security of our country, not only for today, but for the decades into the future as well. And I had along with the Minister for Foreign Affairs, very significant engagements in Indonesia, in India and in South Korea before we went to the United States. We had very significant discussions, obviously, as well with the United Kingdom, and I spoke with the Secretary this morning, Ben Wallace, who is a great friend of our country and recommitted himself to the process and to the work that we have underway at the moment to look at the acquisition by Australia of the at least eight nuclear-powered submarines, which will provide us with an edge and a capability above that which operates within our region into the next decade, Mr Speaker. That is an incredibly important asset for us to acquire, but it's not the only element of AUKUS. And I think this is a very important point to make. And I see Phil Thompson, the member for Herbert, up on the screen. I was up at Laverack Barracks in Townsville not too long ago and speaking with some of the troops up there, some of whom, I should quickly note, were involved in the extraction of Australian citizens and visa holders in Kabul. And I spoke with Phil and some of those members on FaceTime the other day. Remarkable Australians, but we owe it to them to make sure that we deliver on the other elements of AUKUS. And Mr Speaker, through AUKUS we will collaborate to enhance our joint capabilities across cyber, across artificial intelligence, across quantum technologies and additional undersea capabilities. Mr Speaker, it builds on the 2020 Defence Strategic Update and the Force Structure Plan, and it also includes, importantly, Tomahawk cruise missiles, which will enable our Hobart-class destroyers to strike distant land targets with excellent precision. The RAF will be equipped with long-range anti-ship missiles and joint air-to-surface standoff missiles. Mr Speaker, the Morrison government is determined to keep Australia safe.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The government has been in office for nearly a decade. The COP26 conference in Glasgow starts in just 2 weeks. After a decade, nearly a decade, how much longer is it going to take the Prime Minister to come up with a climate policy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
20% reduction in emissions, Mr Speaker, since 2005, which is the product, Mr Speaker, of the policies that we have put in place, Mr Speaker, particularly over these last 8 years, that has ensured, Mr Speaker, that we've been able to be seeing technologies realised, that we've seen that we've been able to drive down those emissions while stabilising and reducing electricity prices and keeping the lights on, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the world knows what our 2030 commitments are. We signed up to them. I took them to the election. At the last election, Mr Speaker, and the Australian people endorsed them. I said we'd meet them and we'd beat them, and we will meet them and we will beat them based on the policies that we've pursued. The technology not taxes approach, the emissions reduction fund, Mr Speaker, the work that we've been doing in the agricultural community. And Mr Speaker, the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction and Industry, I'm sure, could add to more of these. Our policies, Mr Speaker, are reducing emissions. Our policies are reducing emissions. And at the same time, Mr Speaker, we have realised one of the most significant expansions in our LNG industry that we've ever seen, Mr Speaker. At the same time, we've seen the number of people in manufacturing go up as opposed to under Labor, when 1 in 8 manufacturing jobs were lost. So under our policies, Mr Speaker, we're getting emissions down, we're getting solar panels on people's roofs, we're seeing record investments in renewable energy, we're meeting and beating our targets, we're getting Australians into manufacturing jobs, we're expanding our resources industries, Mr Speaker. That's what the Coalition's plans are doing. That's what they're doing. And we intend them to keep doing that as we pursue policies in this area which ensure we do the right thing by jobs, we do the right thing by the environment, we do the right thing by our national energy security, Mr Speaker, that ensures that Australians can look forward to their future with confidence, whether they're living in the Hunter, Mr Speaker, or they're living in the south coast of New South Wales, or out in Portland, Mr Speaker, where we've ensured that the Port Near Aluminium smelter will continue to operate and continue to run and support those jobs, Mr Speaker. That's what our energy emissions reductions and environmental policies are achieving for Australia. And we will continue to make decisions in that vein. We will continue to do that, Mr Speaker, and we will not be taxing our way there. That is the approach that the Labor Party pursued when they were last in government. That's their approach. Taxes, not technology, Mr Speaker. We are technology, not taxes. That's how we get ourselves to achieve these goals. That's how we can make our way through the very difficult global economic challenges that will confront Australia over the next 30 years. We have been careful in considering each of these decisions because we are mindful of the impact that it can have on rural and regional areas. We haven't signed Australia up with blank cheque commitments like those opposite have.
Prime Minister's
we
time
would
has
make
concluded.
and continue to make decisions based
the member for Groom has the call.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the excellent Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is securing the affordable and reliable energy that Australian families and businesses rely on, and how this will assist our economic recovery from the pandemic?
The Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Groom for his excellent question, Mr Speaker, representing Toowoomba, as he does, a region with an extraordinary history in those great industries which are the backbone of this great country, Mr Speaker. It's our resources sector, you see there, leading-edge agriculture, Mr Speaker, leading-edge manufacturing, like we see with Obaded, a business that I was lucky enough to visit recently up in Toowoomba. And, Mr Speaker, they are reliant, like so many manufacturing businesses, whether it's in the members' electorate or right across Australia, on affordable, reliable energy, Mr Speaker. And we have seen recently around the world what happens when governments lose focus on customers in energy markets, Mr Speaker, because in the UK, for example, we've seen how reliance on imported gas and wind droughts combined, prolonged wind droughts, have plunged that country into an energy crisis, Mr Speaker. Default energy prices have increased by 12%, Mr Speaker, 12%, affecting up to 15 million households across the UK, and we are determined to make sure that doesn't happen in Australia. Now, critical to that is gas, Mr Speaker, much of which comes from the Surat Basin near Toowoomba. Mr Speaker, our manufacturing sector depends on gas. Over 40% of the gas used in a manufacture, or the energy used in manufacturing, comes from gas. And across our manufacturing sector, despite COVID, we are now seeing that there are 80,000 more Australians working in manufacturing than before the beginning of COVID, Mr Speaker. 80,000 more. We've got more than 1 million people working in manufacturing in this country, and they're reliant on affordable, reliable energy, and the key to that is balance, Mr Speaker. Now, we've seen 13.3 gigawatts of new renewable capacity come in 2 years, each of those years more than the entire time when Labor was in government, Mr Speaker, but that needs to be balanced with dispatchable capacity. And that's what National Cabinet has agreed on in recent reforms that went through National Cabinet, but we're also filling gaps that are emerging, like when the Liddell generator closes in the Hunter Valley, Mr Speaker. Energy Australia will replace that with Tallawarra, and us with the Snowy Kurri Kurri gas generator. But that's not the end of it, Mr Speaker. The Kidston Pump Hydro project in Queensland, the Port Kembla gas generator, and Snowy Hydro, Mr Speaker, where we've seen just today Snowy launch its new precast factory in Cooma, where 130,000 concrete segments for the tunnels are being produced locally, supporting 220 direct jobs and thousands of indirect jobs, Mr Speaker. We're getting on with the job of delivering affordable, reliable energy as we bring down our emissions.
The member for Oxley.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. When the Prime Minister arrives in Glasgow in a fortnight's time, will he tell the meeting electric vehicles will end the weekend, batteries to store renewable energy are as useful as the big banana and the big prawn, and renewable energy targets are nuts?
The Prime Minister has the
Mr Speaker, I don't accept the caricature that the member has put forward. Mr Speaker, it's just simply not the case.
Members on my left.
It's a complete misrepresentation, which I'm completely used to from the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. They can treat the parliament in that way and treat it like a comedy act, Mr Speaker. But these are very serious issues we're dealing here with as a country. While Labor seeks to joke about climate policy, Mr Speaker, the government is focused very clearly on the decisions we have to make about what is going to impact on the livelihoods and lives of Australians over the next 30 years. And, Mr Speaker, we are not taking a glib approach like those opposite did. They just signed up, Mr Speaker, with a blank cheque.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. It goes to relevance. These are the Prime Minister's own quotes, his own glib comments.
The Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat. Leader of the Opposition can resume his seat, and I'm going to point out very clearly he may well raise that on a point of order, but the question didn't ask that. The question asked him whether he'd do three things, and it could have been ruled out on any number of aspects of the standing orders, but when a question like that's asked, it's been my practice to allow the free-flowing debate. Otherwise, I'll be ruling them out. You can't ask a question like that and expect that there won't be some sort of political response. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The commitment about net zero at 2050 is a very serious matter. It's going to have big impacts and big opportunities for Australia in the future. You don't do it glibly. You don't just sign up to it without a plan, which is what I've said from this dispatch box on many occasions. You don't go and sign Australia up to something like that unless you carefully consider what the plan is and what the impacts of that plan are. Now, Mr Speaker, we have been going through that very exercise very seriously as a cabinet, as a coalition government, as a serious government does to make these important decisions. We understand that the global changes happening in our economy because of the response to climate change are going to have adverse impacts in Australia, in rural and regional areas in particular. That is going to occur, and our plans are designed to address that and to recognise the opportunities that can be gained from the changes that are occurring around the world to ensure that Australia can emerge more strongly based on the plans that we're working on, Mr Speaker. That's how we're coming to a decision on this issue. Those opposite came to a decision to commit Australia to 2050 without any plan, without any estimate, without any modelling, Mr Speaker. They claim some modelling, but that modelling assumes a carbon price. It assumes a carbon tax, Mr Speaker. That is where the Labor Party is at. We are doing this on the basis of careful consideration of the impacts on Australians of our decisions. This is one of the biggest decisions that this country has to make, and we will make it carefully, we will make it collaboratively, we will be listening to Australians as we have done, Mr Speaker, over the course of this term to prepare for this very moment, to ensure that when we can consider this issue, we can do so in a way where we can position Australia strongly for the future. Mr Speaker, this is about an economic plan that gets Australia through one of these great challenges. We will have such a plan. We do have such a plan, Mr Speaker. The lower emissions technology plan already set out, which those opposite, even right now in the Senate, are seeking to disallow a regulation, Mr Speaker, which would see us be able to invest in clean energy technologies, in carbon capture, use and storage, and they are opposing it.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The question, seeking to table a document. The Leader of the Opposition seeking
leave to table a document by Phil Curry, Scott Morrison mocks South
the
Australia's big
Leader
batteries
of
like
the
the big banana.
Opposition can resume his seat. I've made it clear that I won't even ask for leave to table newspaper articles that are readily available. The member for Riverina.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government is modernising and investing in Australia's agricultural innovation system, ensuring that this key pillar of our Ag 2030 plan is supporting industry's target of a $100 billion sector by 2030?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And I thank the member for Riverina for his question. I acknowledge also his significant contribution as Deputy Prime Minister in helping us achieve that Ag 2030 plan with cold hard cash, and particularly around the innovation systems, which has played a pivotal role in taking agriculture to the first time to over $70 billion. Innovation is driving that and will get us on that trajectory towards $100 billion. And we're doing that through our 15 commodity research development corporations, whether it be beef, cotton, grain, sugar, horticulture. They are the vehicles in which are driving that, and we've put over $147 million in modernising that since July 2020, plus the $1.1 billion a year that goes into agricultural innovation from levy payers and the Australian taxpayer. And while we've had great success, we are ranked number 23 in the world. We have the same number of researchers and scientists as the United States and Netherlands, who are 4 and 6 in the world. So we are on reform to ensure that we become #1 in the world, and we've created a new mechanism and modernising that innovation system to ensure we have the environment and infrastructure to achieve that. We've created Agriculture Innovation Australia, a commercial entity that will help to ensure that we get back to the first principles of agricultural innovation. Value to the levy payer, value to the taxpayer, remove duplication and commercialisation. And we're giving them the tools to do that. And the first tool was our GrowAg platform, a digital platform that lists all the research and development that all our 15 research and development corporations are doing. We launched that in April last year up in Wagga, and can I say since then there are over 15,500 users of that website from over 130 countries, and since then we've had over 120 commercial inquiries to partner with our research development corporations, our regional universities, to put money and to partner with our capital to ensure that we have even better research and development. But we're going a step further in making sure we have a physical platform for those that want to invest to come and feel and touch and understand the research that we're doing. And we put $86 million into 8 innovation hubs right across the country, one at Charles Sturt University that the former Deputy Prime Minister opened with me back in April last year. And that's played a pivotal role in making sure that the research and development is being done at a local level so that the adoption is being taken up by the farmers, not only allowing those to interact with our investors, but our farmers in understanding what's important to them. And those investments are driving the decisions of commercial entities around the world and foreign states to look to Australia as a leader in agricultural innovation, but also creating the new jobs of Australian agriculture, bringing the next generation into the new jobs in science and technology in regional universities and connecting them to the users that we want to adopt this technology the most, the Australian farmer. This is the environment and infrastructure we're putting around our innovation system to ensure we continue to produce the best food and fibre in the world.
The Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the Deputy Prime Minister said that a net zero by 2050 target couldn't be legislated because of the impact on Australia if the target wasn't met. Doesn't this show this is another announcement the Prime Minister has no intention of delivering?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, on the same basis that Australia made its commitment to Kyoto, the same basis that we've made our commitment to Paris, Mr Speaker, is the same basis we would take anything forward at Glasgow. And the proof of our record, Mr Speaker, is we have met Kyoto 1, we have met Kyoto 2, we are going to meet Paris 2030 and in fact beat Paris 2030. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition seems to confuse the processes that he wishes to engage in as having some material impact on what the outcome will be. Australians understand outcomes, and the outcomes are that under our government emissions are falling. They're falling, Mr Speaker. They're coming down. Emissions have fallen by 20% and more, Mr Speaker, on 2005 levels. They're lower, Mr Speaker. And that's not the only thing that's lower. Unemployment's lower, Mr Speaker. Youth unemployment's lower, Mr Speaker. The level of investment in this country is greater, Mr Speaker. There are more Australians working in manufacturing today, Mr Speaker, and there were less under the Labor Party when they were in power, Mr Speaker. We've got major big resources projects happening all around the country, Mr Speaker. We are seeing our LNG industry go from strength to strength, being world-leading, and at the same time, our policies are reducing emissions. Mr Speaker, outcomes count, not broad rhetorical statements from politicians, Mr Speaker. Outcomes count. Outcomes count. And so let me remind the House of a few outcomes. 20% reduction in emissions, 69.2% of Australians aged over 16 vaccinated, the lowest rate of fatality for COVID, Mr Speaker, of almost any country in the world, the lowest unemployment rate in more than a decade, Mr Speaker. They're the results that the Labor Party don't want to speak about.
Can resume his seat. Has the Prime Minister concluded his answer? The member for Curtin.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry and Minister for Science and Technology. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government's investment in our defence industry is creating jobs and supporting our economic recovery as we come back from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Defence Industry and Minister for Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Curtin for her question and acknowledge and thank her for her passion and interest in defence industry, particularly in our home state of Western Australia. Mr Speaker, our government's $270 billion investment in our defence capabilities is not only delivering the essential equipment that our men and women in uniform require for the safety and security of our country. As important as that is, Mr Speaker, it is also creating and supporting thousands of Australian jobs in the cities and right across the Australia's regions. And it's also supporting our economic recovery as we bounce back from COVID-19, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our government is investing $210 million to overhaul the health facilities for our troops in our Defence Force at RAF Base Townsville in Queensland, in Puckapunyal in Victoria, in Campbell Barracks in Western Australia, and across more than a dozen locations as we build and we upgrade those incredibly critically important healthcare facilities for our men and women in uniform. And this is truly a national endeavour, Mr Speaker, as this project will deliver health services to 35,000 ADF personnel. And as well as that, it will support some 6,000 local jobs within the construction project. Mr Speaker, on average, across these projects, 92% of work has gone to local businesses, and in many cases the targets for local involvement has actually been exceeded. And I saw this work firsthand only recently when I visited RAF Base Pearce with the Honourable Simon Birmingham, where we had an opportunity to look at the new health facilities at Pearce. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank those health professionals that we met for the very good service that they provided and the tour, and just to thank them for looking after the health of our ADF personnel. Mr Speaker, as we heard from the Minister for Defence today, the Australian defence industry should also be gearing up for the opportunities that AUKUS will offer. The delivery of nuclear-powered submarines will require our Australian industry to be involved to help us build and to sustain those nuclear submarines. But a closer partnership with Mr Speaker with respect to the US and the UK will also mean opportunities beyond shipbuilding. And I refer to our government's investment of $100 billion over the next 20 years on our sovereign-guided weapons enterprise. And our Australian small and medium-sized businesses are going to be critical for the success of that important enterprise. Mr Speaker, we are not slowing down. We are backing our Australian defence industries in the bush and in the city for the defence of our nation.
The member for Macquarie.
Thank you, Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister. The Minister for Regionalisation said yesterday that regional Australians are out of sight and out of mind for the Liberal Party. Is that why the Prime Minister has refused to recognise the economic opportunities of climate action for regional Australia for so long?
The Prime Minister has the
call. Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Deputy Prime Minister. I'm happy to refer to him also in responding to this question about the many achievements that this government has been able to realise for rural and regional Australia. And I simply make this point, that the challenges that are occurring globally because of the world's response to climate change will have significant impacts on rural and regional Australia. But they also present significant opportunities. And the plans that the government are considering will ensure that we can deal with both the costs and the benefits, Mr Speaker, because we understand there are impacts, that this is not a road, Mr Speaker, that is only where you will find opportunities. You will find difficult impacts on Australia, and the government understands that. The Liberal Party understands that, the National Party understands that, because that's where our constituents live, Mr Speaker. Between the Liberal and the National parties, and the Liberal Party in particular, we represent more regional seats in this parliament than any other party in this parliament. And we're joined together with the Nationals, Mr Speaker, and together we are the representation of regional Australia overwhelmingly in this parliament. And, Mr Speaker, that means we understand the impacts. And that's why our plans carefully consider the impacts on rural and regional Australia. And that's why our infrastructure plans, our skills plans, our manufacturing and industry plans, ensuring that we can have heavy industry in places like Gladstone, Mr Speaker, and even down there in the Shoalhaven, Mr Speaker, with the plants that are there. All of these places, Mr Speaker, we understand the importance of heavy industry, agriculture, the resources sector to rural and regional Australia Australia and the contribution that makes to Australia's future. And that's why every single plan you get from a coalition government will be good for rural and regional Australia, but the Deputy Prime Minister may wish to add.
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable member for a question and note so many of the projects, whether you go to Tasmania with Scottsdale Irrigation District, we can start in Gippsland with the McAllister Irrigation District, we can go to roads such as the Hume Highway or the Pacific Highway or the Bruce Highway, we can go to North Queensland and say that the Hells Gate Dam business case will be back in early next year. We can go to Rookwood Weir and actually see us building it. We can go to the Inland Rail, 1,716 kilometres, and talk about how that is going to be the corridor of commerce to drive ahead regional areas. Or we can talk about the business plan that we've currently got on the table for the Gladstone to Toowoomba link. All these things are merely but a part. If we go to Western Australia, we can see the massive amounts that we're currently putting to road infrastructure right to the very north into the Kimberleys, hundreds of millions of dollars that have been poured in there, or going to the defence infrastructure of Darwin or the defence infrastructure of Rockhampton. There is not, without a shadow of a doubt, a massive investment that's been done by the Nationals, which is solely the only party that has regional representatives, and also the Liberal Party, which has so many
Deputy
representatives
Prime Minister's
of their own.
time has concluded. And I call the member for Reid.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Assistant Treasurer, Minister for Housing, Minister for Homelessness, Social and Community Housing. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government's home guarantee schemes are accelerating the dream for Australians of owning their own home? And is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Housing has the call.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. And can I thank the member for Reid for her question. She is a champion for first home buyers in her electorate. And in fact, under our Prime Minister, we are a government for first home buyers. There's no doubt about it. And Mr Speaker, one of the solemn commitments that we took to the last election was to establish our home guarantee schemes, the first home loan deposit scheme, which would help first home buyers purchase their first home with a deposit of as little as 5%. Now, in about 18 months since that time, since the establishment of that program, we've had more than 53,000 Australians who have been able to get into their first home with the help of the Morrison government's home guarantee scheme. Now, Mr Speaker, building on the remarkable success of that program, in the last budget, the Prime Minister, the Treasurer and myself were very proud to announce a new aspect of the home guarantee scheme, which was the family home guarantee. One of the things that we understood, yes, for first home buyers, getting that deposit together is the hardest part of getting into a new home. But if you're a single parent trying to raise children, paying for their education, paying for your rent, getting into your home, a first home in many cases, is extraordinarily difficult. So we put in place the family home guarantee, which helps single parents purchase a home with a deposit of as little as 2%. We've had now well more than 1,500 single parents purchase their new home, and it's only been in place since the beginning of this financial year. And we're starting to see some wonderful stories coming through, Mr Speaker. And I've got some really, I think, heartwarming testimonials from single parents who've utilised this scheme. I received this note from single mother Nicole, and it's fair to say 84% of single parents in Australia are women. Nicole sent this to me. With the amount of rent we were paying, we were never going to be able to save enough for a deposit. The family home guarantee has given us the ability to buy without having to try and come up with a huge deposit. Buying a house means we get to make memories in a house we'll never have to leave. Now, Mr Speaker, that's why we extended this scheme to single parents. Mr Speaker, another testimonial from single mother Cindy. Not having to pack up and move around if the landlord sells the place, and not having to live through inspections every 3 months, this has changed my life. So, Mr Speaker, not only through the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, but the Home Builder program, 135,000 Australians and their families helped into home ownership. That's well more, when you add those together, 200,000 Australian families enabled to get into a home with the support of the Morrison government. We are a government for first home buyers.
The member for Gellibrand.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Is member for Gellibrand, yeah.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Yesterday, the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, said that the Morrison-Joyce government is, quote, caught in this vice of this really strong group of climate denialists who basically don't take global warming seriously. How can Australians trust the Prime Minister will deliver on anything that he announces on emissions reductions this week?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Because under our government's policies, emissions are coming down and jobs are going up, Mr Speaker. Because that's the outcome of our policies. That is the exact outcome of our policies. Policies that we've put in place, Mr Speaker, not just under my time, but indeed my predecessor's time and under former Prime Minister Abbott, Mr Speaker. Under 3 Prime Ministers, Mr Speaker, we have been putting in place the policies which have been ensuring that we shore up the reliability of our energy supply and put downward pressure on electricity prices. Mr Speaker. We got rid of, under Prime Minister Abbott, the carbon tax, which was legislated by those opposite, Mr Speaker, which put prices up, Mr Speaker. We got rid of that, as we promised to do, and there will never be a carbon price under this government, Mr Speaker. But I notice from Labor Senator Gallagher that it's back on the table with the Labor Party, Mr Speaker. It's back on the table because they want to tell people what they have to do. They want to price people into what they want them to do. We have a greater level of confidence, Mr Speaker, about what Australians want to do, the choices they want to make, the choices we want to enable, whether it's getting into their first home, Mr Speaker, or what type of car they want to buy. And even if they want to get vaccinated, we don't think they have to be bribed to do it, Mr Speaker, by those opposite and the policies that they put forward. We have great faith in Australians, Mr Speaker. We have great faith that they are making the choices which are good for them and their family, and the policies that we're putting in place enable their choices, which will continue to see emissions come down, which will continue to see new technologies develop, which will continue to see more consumer choice available, and Australia continue to achieve in this area. Mr Speaker, there will be many who will go to the conference in Glasgow and make great bold commitments, Mr Speaker, but very few will be able to go there and say, Kyoto 1, done. Kyoto 2, done. Paris, we will meet and we will beat. That is our record, Mr Speaker. Our emissions reductions, Mr Speaker, exceed those of Canada, they exceed those of New Zealand, they exceed those of the United States, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our record is getting emissions down, putting downward pressure on electricity prices. The record of those opposite, Mr Speaker, is that they drove electricity prices up with their carbon taxes, Mr Speaker, and they made Australians pay for their policies. On this side of the House, Mr Speaker, our policies are about taking the burdens off. Our policies are about doing the right thing by rural and regional Australia and households, Mr Speaker, so they can have the choices that they want to have, so they can plan for their future with confidence. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, want to sign Australia up with a blank cheque and no plan and make Australians pay for it.
The member for Barara.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister outline how the Morrison government's childcare policies are supporting Australian families and businesses during the COVID-19 pandemic and how they will help our post-lockdown recovery?
The Minister for Education and Youth.
Well, can I thank the member for Barara for his question? And he knows, as we all do in this place, just how important childcare is, particularly to allow parents to go to the paid workforce if they indeed want to do that. And that's why, Mr Speaker, that during this pandemic we have put $3 billion of extra funding into the childcare providers to keep them stable, to keep them afloat, to keep them going, and particularly for those essential workers. But it's also why we announced just in the budget of this year additional subsidies for those families with 2 or more children in childcare. And we did this because even though the out-of-pocket hourly rate for most families is reasonably modest, when you have 2 or more kids in childcare, it can add up. And we also know that the greatest workforce disincentives are precisely when you have 2 or more children in childcare at any one particular time. And so our policy added an additional 30 percentage points of subsidy for your second and subsequent children, Mr Speaker, capping out at 95% subsidy for those particular children. On top of this, we got rid of the overall annual fee cap, which of course can be a real barrier for women to continue in the workforce. Mr Speaker, in the budget we said that we would start this in the middle of next year, in July of next year, because that was the advice we had at the time. But we've been working very hard to see if we can bring this forward, which is what we always said. And I'm pleased to tell the House that we will be able to begin this on the 7th of March of next year. And this is great news for families and great news for businesses, because of what it means is for those 250,000 families that will benefit, they will have an additional $700 in their pocket this financial year. What it means for families next financial year and the subsequent ones is that they will have $2,200 on average in their pocket as a result of this policy. What's more, Mr Speaker, it's also good for the economy, because Treasury has estimated that an additional 40,000 people will work more as a result of this policy, adding $1.5 billion to GDP on an annual basis. So this policy, Mr Speaker, is good for families, it's good for the economy, it's good for business, and it's great policy developed by the Coalition. It's in such a stark contrast to the reckless policies of the Labor Party, a $20 billion policy where the major beneficiaries are millionaires under their policy, Mr Speaker. It's no wonder that the Labor Party is in such turmoil when they're eating themselves alive, because they're spending $20 billion of everyday working families' money to pay for the millionaires to have their childcare. $50,000
Minister's time has concluded. The member for Newcastle.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Regional Development, representing the Minister for Regionalisation. Yesterday, the Minister for Regionalisation said about government policy for regional Australia, "There are no friends for the National Party at the moment, not a friend in the country. The peak bodies have deserted us and not a friend internationally." Does the Minister agree that there is no support for this policy?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for a question and note that there was certainly no support for any Labor Party policy. That one fell right over. What I can also say, Mr Speaker, is that what we are doing in the Nationals is what would be expected of us in our regional constituencies. One would think that it would be the same that would be expected in the constituencies of Eden Monaro, where you would have the capacity to sit down and diligently go through, as we have, to make sure that how we represent our people back in our area is an earnest representation of the efforts that they are going through on our behalf in making sure that our nation continues on with the standard of living it has. We reflect and understand quite clearly that if it wasn't for our coal exports, which I wonder whether the Minister obviously stands behind. I presume she does, being from Newcastle, and Newcastle being a very strong, one of the greatest coal exporting port in the world. In fact, coal prices are determined by the price at Newcastle. It's the Newcastle price. And this is why we are making sure that the people of the Hunter Valley and in Newcastle clearly understand that we have their livelihoods foremost in our mind as we go forward, as we diligently and prudently assess what is before us in such a way as we can make the proper decisions on that. And that process continues on, and we will make sure that the Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia has a response from us by the end of this week as to what we see as the pertinent issues, and to have further discussions in that place. This is not grandstanding, this is not ransom, as has been put forward by so many people. This is making sure we do our job, and we will continue to do our job. Now, what I can say is that the Labor Party have signed us up, Mr Speaker. They're going to legislate it. They're going to legislate it. But they haven't actually told the people of the Hunter Valley what that means. And so the people of the Hunter Valley are a little bit of a quandary as to whether they're still going to have a job, whether they'll be able to pay for their house, whether they'll be able to pay for their car. See, Mr Speaker,
The Labor Party are going to legislate it. They say so. They say they're going to legislate it. So the people of central Queensland, whether they're in Emerald, whether they're in Rockhampton, whether they're in Townsville, are wondering under a Labor Party whether they're going to have a job, whether they can pay for their house, whether they can pay for their car, whether they can pay for their children's school. See, Mr. Speaker, the Labor Party have said they're going to legislate it. But they haven't actually told the people of Port Kembla what that means for them, or the people who work at the ports of Newcastle what that means for them. All the Labor Party knows, I know you want to wind me up now, but I'm afraid I'll just keep going right to the end, because the end is where you're taking your blue-collar workers. You no longer ever care for them.
The Deputy Prime Minister's time has concluded, and I give the call to the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. Will the Minister update the House on the Morrison government's commitment to a lasting and peaceful presence in Antarctica and maintaining Tasmania's place as the world's gateway to Antarctica, ensuring local jobs and investments for my home state of Tasmania?
The Minister for the Environment has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the member for Bass for her question, commend her on all of the extraordinary work she does for her constituents. She called me the other day from a windswept Flinders Island asking me to sort something out for her, and of course I shall. So thank you, member for Bass, for being part of Tasmania's recognition of the importance of our Antarctic division. Australia is a proud Antarctic nation.
Member for Macarthur. The Minister has the call.
Australia is a proud Antarctic nation, and the icy continent has featured prominently, Mr. Speaker, in our national story and our national interests, dating back to the early expeditions of Sir Douglas Mawson. Australia was an original signature to the Antarctic Treaty signed by the Menzies government 60 years ago. The treaty established the Antarctic as a non-militarised region with multinational efforts for peace and collaborative scientific endeavour, and today I would add for the protection of the environment in the world's last untouched wilderness. A modern Australian Antarctic program that supports the Antarctic Treaty system is critical for Australia to continue delivering world-class science and run safe and efficient operations. Over the weekend, Hobart saw the arrival of our new $1.9 billion icebreaker, the RSV Noina. The 160-metre-long vessel is the most advanced research platform of its kind in the world. It's capable of breaking through 1.65 metres of sea ice. It can deal with 14-metre seas, hurricane winds and temperatures of minus 30 degrees. It is the world's quietest icebreaker for scientific research, with minimal disturbance to the ecosystems below. A truly incredible ship. Carrying up to 4 helicopters. In fact, the heli deck is the size of 7 cricket pitches, 117 personnel, 32 crew, 92 days at sea, 3 permanent scientific laboratories and a moon pool for direct access to the ocean through the hull. Fantastic for the partnerships we have with other nations who can collaborate with their researchers and their expeditioners on board the ship. The Noina provides an ongoing reminder of the Morrison government's commitment to Tasmania as an international Antarctic science hub, and it arrived just days after the 40th anniversary of the Australian Antarctic Division's move to Hobart in 1981. It sends a clear signal to Tasmanians that the Morrison government is focused on local investment, on creating jobs and growing Antarctic industries so that Hobart can be the world's greatest Antarctic gateway. We remain committed to scientific research, protecting the environment and ensuring the continent is only used for peaceful purposes. And we look forward to continuing to work closely with other nations as we deliver a new era of Antarctic endeavour, with Australia and particularly Tasmania leading the world.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice board.
Just before I call the Leader of the House, pursuant to Section 65 of the Parliamentary Service Act 1999, I present the annual reports for 2020-2021 of the Department of the House of Representatives and the Department of Parliamentary Services. And I also present the Auditor General's Information Report No. 7 of 2021-2022, entitled Australian Government Grants Reporting. The Leader of the House.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
I thank the Leader of the House. And we'll go straight to the matter of public importance. I've received a letter from the honourable member for McMahon.